Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 24th, 2021. Today we're going to take up the question, are the common aims of mankind still attainable in this moment of profound global crisis? It's worth looking at this because not only are they attainable, but if they're not attained, we face a horrible future driven by the greed and the insanity of an oligarchy which is committed to global war. Now, at the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt put forward this idea of using the post-war period to adopt a policy committed to realizing the common aims of mankind. This started with rebuilding the nations destroyed by war, including Germany and Japan. It included an end to colonialism. What Roosevelt insisted was a necessary feature in the post-war world was not only to have the colonial powers leave, but to have policies of economic development for countries that had been under the yoke of colonialism. And also a reassertion of the principles of international law, included among these non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and the right for nations to use their own resources, including developing their own populations, for sovereign economic development. That was part of the policy that FDR had in mind with the creation of the United Nations. And this is what defined for him the common interests of mankind, that each nation have the right to develop the creative potential, the full potential of each of its citizens. Now, he argued with Churchill over this repeatedly during the war. He told Churchill, the U.S. bailed out the British Empire twice in this century and paid for it with money and blood of American men and women. And he said, never again will Americans die for the interests of the British Empire. Now, Lyndon LaRouche saw this firsthand during his service in the China-Burma-India theater. He was in India at the end of the war, where he saw directly in front of him the struggle for justice of the Indian people to throw out the colonial power of Great Britain. And this affected him and committed him to an idea of devoting a life to ending this evil of colonialism, the control of one power over the people of another nation. Now, he also saw how these plans of Roosevelt were hijacked. Roosevelt died before the end of the war, and Truman was convinced to use nuclear weapons in Japan when they weren't necessary. The Japanese were moving towards surrender, having been defeated by MacArthur's offensive. And yet the use of nuclear weapons was meant to show the rest of the world that you had to submit to a U.S. world order, in this case, a U.S.-British world order, or face the consequences. After the nuclear attack on Japan, Bertrand Russell, who was later lionized as a peacenik, Russell advocated a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union as a way of destroying the one power that could stop the United States and could use the destruction of Russia or the Soviet Union as the basis of establishing a world empire. That is a new British empire backed up by U.S. military might. What LaRouche always referred to as the British thinking was British brains and U.S. brawn. When Russia developed their own nuclear weapons very quickly, this put an end to this idea of a preemptive strike, and instead the adoption of what truly is an insane doctrine, whose initials spell it out: MAD, mutual and assured destruction. You use nukes, we'll use our nukes, we'll destroy the world. So therefore, anything short of nuclear war is acceptable. This was a new colonial doctrine, and this was very much what existed from the late 1940s up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. And it was combined with Churchill's push for a world divided into two empires, the West versus the Soviet Empire. This was the implication of his Iron Curtain speech, as well as the document which defined U.S. policy by diplomat George Kennan, the Long Telegram, which advocated a containment militarily of the Soviet Union after the war. Now, this pretty much lasted until 1989, but during that period of time, you had a series of crises where we could have ended up with nuclear weapons being used. In Vietnam, in 1954, the U.S. moved in. When the French were routed by the Vietnamese forces, the U.S. moved in. And at various points in time, including in the 1970s, early 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger actually discussed using nuclear weapons to destroy North Vietnam. Against China, in 1958, we now have seen the documents that were just recently released that show that John Foster Dulles was trying to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff to convince Eisenhower to use nuclear weapons against China over the Taiwan crisis. Fortunately, Eisenhower refused to do that, and we avoided a nuclear war then. And then again in the Cuban Missile Crisis, one which was organized by the CIA, which was an attempt to get Kennedy to bluff using nuclear weapons against Russia, but be prepared to use them. And fortunately, John Kennedy used back channels to Russia to not only end that crisis, but to begin the possibility of collaboration with the Soviet Union to put an end to mutual and assured destruction. Instead, the oligarchy put an end to the presidency of John F. Kennedy with bullets to his head. Now, besides Kennedy's effort at detente, the Reagan administration, through Lyndon LaRouche, tried to use the Strategic Defense Initiative as a means of achieving an end to the MAD doctrine and move into an era of peaceful cooperation. That too was sabotaged. And part of its sabotage was based on Kissinger and others launching the Get LaRouche Task Force, which ended up putting Lyndon LaRouche in prison. And one of the key activists in that Get LaRouche Task Force was none other than Robert Mueller. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, we had George Herbert Walker Bush, as president, proclaim the beginnings of a new world economic order based on U.S. unilateralism, the power of the United States to impose its will on every other nation. This is, in a sense, the beginning of what we now hear repeatedly from Biden and his team, the so-called rules-based order. This was the era of the end of history doctrine of Francis Fukuyama, who said democracy has triumphed, free markets have triumphed, everyone else has to submit to this rule. And the New American Century doctrine, the PNAC, which was a unilateral declaration of a unipolar world. This was part of that. And we've seen since then a series of endless wars, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in the Balkans, whether it's in Africa. We see the attempt to dominate on behalf of the City of London and Wall Street interests, which put the world again and again on the course toward war. Today, with the collapsing of the transatlantic system because of its failed economic policies, we're seeing an attempt to establish a new degree of empire under the so-called Great Reset, a global central bankers dictatorship, and the Green New Deal, which is a Malthusian doctrine of radical population reduction. We have Admiral Richard of Stratcom, Strategic Command, saying that we have to recognize that we've gone from an era where nuclear war is not possible to a period in which it's a very real possibility for the nuclear employment. That's from the head of the Strategic Command. And it hasn't been refuted by the President or the Secretary of Defense. And yet, most nations still yearn for development. They're still looking for that possibility. We've seen it constantly in declarations, most recently the Putin-Xi Jinping agreement to build new nuclear plants in China, the Belt and Road Initiative, the receptiveness to that initiative from nations of Africa. So the question is posed to us. Do we act on the basis of the common aims for mankind, or will we devolve into hell on earth, defined by depression, pandemic disease, famine, and war? Now, don't rely on the corrupt, immoral oligarchs to do what's right. they're committed to using war if necessary to maintain their control. And don't buy into the idea that there are some benign forces out there that are going to do the right thing if only the time is right for it. No, it's time for the people to reassert their power as the sovereigns, to move based on the sovereign rights granted by God and enumerated in the U.S. Constitution. So I'm calling on our viewers to join us today in achieving the new paradigm that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been discussing, based on the common aims for mankind, and ending forever the rule by powerful but evil oligarchs who are only interested in their private personal interests, their own consumption, their own power, and care not a whit for the vast majority of the world's population who need someone to speak for them. And it's up to us, as those who are committed to the republic of the constitutional republic, to make sure that that alternative today exists. So join us at the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization to be a part of the movement to defeat the Malthusian order, to defeat the new empire, and instead establish the principle of common good among sovereign nation states. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow.